Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Georgia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1913, the air around Augusta carried that peculiar heaviness of the Deep South before a storm, warm, electric, and strangely still. It was the kind of weather that made the polished brass of the Medical College of Georgia's gates glint like they held secrets. Inside those walls, where young men studied the mysteries of anatomy and life itself, there lingered whispers that something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The college had recently opened its new dissection hall, a dimly lit structure of red brick and thick glass panes. Students spoke of the room as if it were alive. The smell of preservatives, formalin and spirits, clung to every surface, mixing with the odor of metal and humidity. Among the students was a man named Elias Hartwell, a quiet apprentice known for his precision and unease. Witnesses later recalled how he often stayed behind after lectures, sketching bones by lamplight, muttering to himself as if answering unheard questions. Locals near Green Street noticed his presence too. "That boy doesn't walk home like others," said a storekeeper in a sworn affidavit dated April 1913. "He stares at the ground, like he's following footsteps that ain't there no more." At first, no one paid him much mind. After all, the town was used to odd hours kept by medical students. Cadavers were brought in at night, and the wagons from nearby hospitals came under tarpaulins to spare the public's sensibilities. But by midsummer, unease began to grow. The janitor, an older man named Ransom Till, told a local reporter that he'd found scratches on the dissection hall's bow. Cement door. Inside, not out. When he mentioned it to Hartwell, the young man simply smiled and said, "The dead sometimes shift when it rains." The college records from that period, brittle now with age, make brief mention of missing instruments and a ledger entry marked "Cadaver miscount resolved." Yet, nothing in the handwriting suggests resolution. Another page, half torn, references a sealed examination room in the West Wing, its purpose unlisted. No further entries exist after August. The Medical College of Georgia, even then, was known for its strict training and formal rituals. Professors demanded silence during examinations, and students were expected to treat everybody as a vessel of learning. But Hartwell's vessel, it seems, had begun to speak to him in ways that were not recorded in any textbook. Neighbors remembered the light from his rented attic room burning late into the night. When someone knocked to complain, no one answered. Inside there were sounds, chairs scraping, water sloshing, a low hum that one woman said wasn't like praying, but close. By autumn, 2 students were missing, both assigned to the same anatomical section as Hartwell. The college administration attributed it to transfers, yet their families never received letters, and their trunks remained uncollected in the dormitory hall. The story would have ended there, buried under institutional decorum, had it not been for a night watchman's report filed in November 1913. A single line that read, "Saw light flicker in the west chamber. Thought all bodies accounted for." That was the last entry before the hall was locked for repairs. Rain returned to Augusta that winter, the kind that softened the red clay roads and soaked through every brick of the old college. In the records of the Burke County Gazette dated December 1913, there's mention of persistent flooding in the western cellar of the medical hall, though the official maintenance ledger lists it merely as drainage issue. Yet those who worked nearby remembered a different odor rising from that place, something not of decay alone, but of rot mixed with iron, and something faintly sweet. Dr. Abram Leland, a senior instructor at the Medical College of Georgia, noted in a private correspondence that he had lost a reliable assistant, Mr. E. Hartwell, who has not reported for duty in several weeks. He added that the young man's work had been exceptionally precise, though lately clouded by nervous ailments and unhealthy fixations. These letters would later be recovered from Leland's widow's trunk in 1927, their edges stained with mildew, the handwriting fading almost to invisibility. According to janitor Ransom Till, the night the flooding began, he heard a sound under the floorboards of the west chamber, a dragging noise, followed by what he called the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't human. When asked later if he could have mistaken it for pipes, he refused to answer. Town gossip turned the disappearance of Elias Hartwell into something half-myth. Some said he'd fled to Savannah, others swore he'd been committed to the Milledgeville Asylum. But there was another rumor, more persistent, that his notes and sketches had been hidden somewhere in the basement, bound in oilskin and labeled only with a crude drawing of a human jaw. A small search party of students went down after hours to see for themselves. One of them, a young man named Corbin Watts, left a testimony in a letter home. "We found the west cellar door jammed," he wrote. "Inside, the air was heavy as if something breathed beneath us. There was a faint glow where the water pooled. We saw a boot print, fresh, smaller than ours, leading toward the bricked-up corner. We did not stay." The college never acknowledged this account, but in the city archive, there's a requisition form from December 21, 1913, for replacement of 23 bricks, lower west wall. The handwriting matches that of the campus custodian. No one mentioned Hartwell's name again in public, yet his absence hovered like humidity, felt but unseen. Even after the hall reopened in spring, students avoided the west side. They said the air there felt colder, though the sunlight came through the same high windows. One entry in the class journal reads simply, "Cadaver 3 removed. No explanation." Years later, when the building was renovated, workers unearthed fragments of an old table leg and rusted instruments wrapped in cloth. The report, filed under routine findings, bears no signature. It seems every trace of Elias Hartwell had been methodically erased, except the unease that stayed behind. By 1914, the dissection hall had regained its formal rhythm, but those who taught there said something in the air had shifted. The ceiling lamps flickered more often, the shadows on the tiled floor seemed longer, and the smell of spirits never quite faded, even on clear mornings. When Dr. Leland resumed his lectures, he reportedly avoided mention of Hartwell altogether, referring only to the unfortunate incident of last year. Yet one student, a quiet Georgian named Samuel Croft, recorded in his notes that the professor's hands shook whenever he passed the west side of the hall. Croft's diary, preserved in a family collection, describes how he found an old scalpel wedged behind a beam near the west wall, its handle etched faintly with the initials E.H. He kept it for a week before throwing it into the river, claiming it hummed when touched. That same month, a woman named Ada Berryman, who cleaned the lecture rooms, told an inspector that she sometimes found wet footprints near the old stairwell before dawn. "They stopped by the drain," she said, "like someone came up from below but didn't finish the climb." Her statement is in the county records, though the date and signature were later struck through. Around this time, the Medical College of Georgia drew attention from a traveling medical examiner, Dr. Henry Collier, known for reviewing irregularities in Southern teaching institutions. He'd visited Augusta before, back in 1909, when the school's cadaver shipments had briefly been suspended due to misplaced documentation. His report then had been routine. His return in 1914, however, coincided with renewed rumors about unaccounted materials in the west basement. Collier met with Leland privately on February 17th. The minutes of that meeting, discovered decades later in a retired archivist's folder, mention that Collier requested access to Section W, but was denied. The reason given, temporary quarantine. No record of any illness exists that year. Leland's assistant, a young clerk named Marin Voss, claimed he overheard Collier say, "You've sealed more than a room here, Doctor." 2 weeks later, Collier left Augusta abruptly. His subsequent writings make no mention of the college, though one notebook entry reads, "Something walks when it shouldn't. Georgia will forget, as it always does." That spring, the floods returned. The cellar pumps failed, and the west wall cracked under pressure. Students working late reported hearing the sluicing of water in the dark corridors, though the rain had stopped hours before. A watchman, possibly the same one from the previous year, filed a short report. Observed movement behind the brickwork. sounded like breathing. The entry was never followed up. Life went on, lessons resumed, and new cadavers arrived from the county hospital. Yet every spring, a faint tremor of anxiety passed through the halls when thunder rolled over Augusta. Some said it was the weather. Others, more quietly, said it was the echo of something left unfinished, buried in the mortar, waiting for another crack to let it rise. By midsummer of 1914, the West Chamber was sealed for good. Officially, the college declared it unsafe due to moisture damage. Yet those who worked nearby swore the closure came after an unreported incident, something that left stains on the steps and a dent in the brass doorframe, as though someone had fought to get out. No students were withdrawn, no police were summoned, and the matter vanished from the papers as quickly as it had surfaced. Still, people whispered. In the Augusta Herald's archive, a small column appears without author credit. A student of anatomy found delirious near Green Street claims to have seen the wet man behind the cellar wall, declined further comment. The name was withheld, but later handwriting across the clipping reads, Croft. If Samuel Croft truly survived that night, his testimony never reached the college board. Instead, his family reported him missing in September, and his belongings were quietly shipped to his mother's home in Athens. Among them was a half-burnt page from a notebook filled with anatomical sketches, each incomplete, as if the artist had abandoned them mid-line. The only finished drawing depicted a human face, mouth open, eyes without pupils. Written beneath, "Not dead." The Medical College of Georgia continued its classes through the Great War years, training field surgeons and coroners. Yet letters from graduates during 1915 to 1918 mentioned the same odd rumor of a figure glimpsed through the frosted windows during evening dissections, standing just beyond the west wall, motionless and slick as though soaked from rain. None dared investigate, and the faculty discouraged discussion. Superstition is the enemy of science, one memo reads, but fear lingers in quiet corners, and it had found a permanent place here. In 1920, Dr. Leland retired and left Augusta. He died 2 years later, his papers sealed by his estate. When Hay were finally catalogued decades afterward, archivists found among his notes a single letter addressed but never sent to Dr. Collier. It read, "You were right. It wasn't the cadavers that were misplaced. It was something we brought with them." Below his signature was an unfamiliar mark, like a small circular stamp or the ring left by a wet jar bottom. In the same year, the old dissection hall caught fire. Witnesses described the blaze as swift and silent. No crackling wood, only a rush of heat that left the brick walls blackened but standing. The West Chamber's bricks, curiously, remained damp even after the fire was extinguished. When workers cleared the debris, they found no human remains, no instruments, nothing but a shallow depression in the floor, as if something heavy had once lain there. The college rebuilt, modernized, and the event was officially recorded as electrical fault. But in Augusta's older neighborhoods, stories persisted. Children were warned not to linger by the river on storm nights, lest they hear a knock from below the bridge. 3 slow taps followed by a pause. They called it Hartwell's knock. No one remembered where the name came from anymore, but the fear remained, quiet as water, under stone. By 1923, Augusta was trying to outgrow its ghosts. The city expanded, the mills thrummed again, and the new generation of medical students treated the old stories as jokes from a superstitious past. Yet among the faculty, there were a few who remembered the Western Hall, its locked door, and the smell of wet iron. One of them was Professor Everett Klein, who had been a first-year demonstrator during Hartwell's final term. He rarely spoke of it, but in 1930, Klein granted a short interview to a regional journal on historic anomalies in Southern medical education. He described a season of agitation and irregular attendance around 1913 and hinted that the institution had once harbored something that refused to rest. His words were later dismissed as senile embellishment. Still, the article survives. In the same issue, an anonymous letter to the editor mentions the Medical College of Georgia directly. The cellar wasn't destroyed in the fire, it's still there. Some of us have seen the old stone arch beneath the new floor. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matches that of Marin Voss, the former clerk who'd witnessed Collier's visit. Voss had left Augusta in 1915, taking a position as a coroner's assistant in Macon. He returned briefly in 1929 to settle his mother's estate. Neighbors recalled seeing him near the old campus several nights in a row, standing by the fence after dark. 2 weeks later, he drowned in the river, though there was no sign of struggle. In his pocket was a rusted key marked WC, lower. Authorities noted it was too corroded to fit any known lock from the college's newer buildings. But the initials, West Chamber, were unmistakable. By then, the college had been expanded twice, and the original west section was now buried under a newer annex. Construction workers claimed to have found voids beneath the concrete, narrow enough to fit a man crawling too deep to see the end. They poured fresh cement and didn't record the find. A foreman later told a friend, "We filled it, but it wasn't empty." The Medical College of Georgia moved on, modernized, its name tied to progress and medical innovation. Yet one report from 1934 stands out. An attending student collapsed during a lecture on post-mortem rigidity. When revived, he insisted he'd seen someone standing in the reflection of the autopsy glass. The faculty laughed it off, but the young man withdrew within the week, citing nerves. Decades later, the old campus registry still contained his withdrawal note, unsigned, but beside the date someone had penciled a single name in the margin: Hartwell. The true records of 1913 remain incomplete. The archives show pages torn, others overwritten in different inks. Even now, no clear photograph of the original West Chamber survives. But among the medical students of Augusta, an unspoken rule endured well into the century. Never look too long at your reflection in the dissection glass after midnight. Some said that was when Hartwell's study resumed, waiting for another apprentice to join the lesson he never finished. The 1930s brought renovation to the medical district, and with it, the unearthing of old foundations. Workers pulling up flooring near the former West Annex discovered fragments of iron hooks embedded deep in the masonry. A supervisor, identified only as D. Raines in the county work log, ordered them removed and scrapped without delay. But the foreman on duty, Thomas Laird, later told his brother that one of the hooks wasn't empty. He described a remnant of cloth, aged beyond color, still attached at the bend, damp as though the ground beneath had never dried. Laird quit the project a week later and left Augusta altogether. His resignation letter reads, "Something's still breathing under that place." The following year, 1936, the Medical College of Georgia hosted a centennial exhibition showcasing its history of anatomical science. Among the displays were early dissection tools, preserved specimens, and a series of photographs recovered from an old faculty archive. One of them, marked 1913, depicted a group of students in the dissection hall. The faces were formal, eyes fixed on the camera. Yet archivists noted one peculiarity: a faint blur behind the students, near the west wall, shaped like a man's shoulder and half of a face, bearded, indistinct, but upright. When questioned, the curator dismissed it as exposure damage, though the original glass plate later vanished from storage. Visitors to the exhibition wrote in the guest log about feeling uncomfortable near the West Wing display. One entry, signed by a professor from Savannah, reads, "Some places don't let go of their lessons. This one teaches by silence." His remark was never printed, but the handwriting matches that of Dr. James Keller, a historian who later published an academic paper on the early decades of the college. In it, he referred obliquely to the Hartwell account, describing it as a cautionous hearse, the episode in the misuse of medical study. Keller's work rekindled brief public interest. Local newspapers revisited the Augusta Morgue mystery, printing sanitized retellings of the 1913 incidents, emphasizing institutional secrecy and moral reflection. The public, predictably, consumed it as folklore. But in the faculty records of 1937, an internal memo requested the removal of Keller's book from the college library, pending review. The reason, inappropriate historical speculation. That same month, Keller was found unconscious in his study, his desk soaked by a burst water pipe. He survived, but his notes on the Hartwell case were ruined, pages swollen and illegible. When asked later if he would attempt to rewrite them, he only replied, "Some histories rewrite themselves." In the years that followed, the West Annex began to show strange signs of dampness despite repairs. A maintenance report in 1939 noted, persistent moisture near subfloor, no visible source. Engineers blamed condensation. Still, one remark in the margin stands out, written in different ink. Sounded like movement. Possible airflow below. When the report was archived, someone drew a small circle beside that line. It resembled a ring, or perhaps the mark of a jar bottom pressed to paper, exactly as in Dr. Leland's unsent letter decades before. By the early 1940s, the shadow of war had pushed old stories to the margins, but within the medical college, the West Annex remained a quiet discomfort. New staff rarely asked why the basement had no accessible plans, and the few who did were told that section had been repurposed decades ago. Yet during a blackout drill in 1942, a group of nursing trainees was mistakenly led into the lower corridors. Their instructor, Mrs. Halvers, later wrote in a private note to the dean that they had passed a door sealed with riveted iron, colder than the air around it. She claimed she heard what she thought was slow dripping behind it, but when she touched the metal, it vibrated faintly, like a tuning fork. The students laughed nervously at her reaction, yet none would return to that passage again. Her letter is still stored in the college archives, stamped "Filed, no action." That same winter, a janitor discovered a small collapse near the foundation wall after heavy rain. When workers cleared the debris, they uncovered a shallow cavity filled with standing water. No bones or instruments were found, but lodged in the silt was a brass nameplate bearing the initials E.H. It was logged, cleaned, and placed in the administrative storeroom. 2 months later, the plate vanished. A year after that, the same room was converted into a break area for staff, and the incident was forgotten. Decades later, when an archivist was cataloging renovation photographs, he noticed the nameplate again, hanging in the background of one image, blurred but clear enough to read. The photo was dated incorrectly as 1934, suggesting someone had placed it there intentionally long after its supposed disappearance. The archivist's note ends abruptly. No record of original photographer, negatives missing. The Medical College of Georgia, proud of its longevity, celebrated its 125th anniversary in 1944. Speeches praised progress, science, and the enduring spirit of education through adversity. Not a word was spoken about the closed West Annex. Yet a line from the anniversary program curiously echoes Hartwell's final months. Through study of the body, we confront the mysteries that lie beneath us. It might have been coincidence, or perhaps a phrase borrowed unconsciously from some forgotten lecture note. That same evening, a local journalist reported a strange reflection in the windows during the ceremony, a man's outline watching from the darkened floor below. The janitor assured him no one was permitted inside after hours. The paper never published his story, but the journalist's name appears again in a later clipping, this time in the obituaries, found near the river under uncertain circumstances. His watch had stopped at 12:03 a.m., the exact time the anniversary speech concluded. People moved on, as they always do, yet those who walked the lower hall claimed that on humid nights the scent of wet formalin still drifted through the vents, faint but distinct. Some said it was just the pipes, others that the college was breathing through its oldest wound. By 1946, post-war expansion reached the college once again, and new architects arrived with modern blueprints that promised to replace every vestige of the old structure. When the demolition crews began removing the flooring above the former West Annex, they encountered resistance, not from the masonry, but from the moisture that clung to the subsoil. The earth beneath was unnaturally soft, as if it had never fully settled since the fire decades before. The foreman noted in his log, "Excess humidity localized under Section W, odor of spirits, possible chemical seepage." The site engineer sealed the entry with temporary panels and scheduled a later inspection. That inspection never took place. Weeks later, the foreman himself disappeared. His truck was found parked by the river, doors locked, ignition key still inside. No body was ever recovered. The Augusta Chronicle ran a 2-inch notice. Local contractor missing, presumed drowned. It made no mention of the college or of Section W. In the same year, a graduate assistant named Thomas Derry began compiling oral histories of the institution's earliest days. Among his recorded interviews was one with Professor Emeritus Everett Klein, who was by then nearly blind. Derry's notes describe Klein's voice trembling when asked about the 1913 disappearance. "I remember the boy," Klein said softly, "quiet, careful. He studied the bones as though they'd speak, if given time." When Derry pressed for clarification, the old professor grew silent. The transcript ends with Klein whispering, "The mistake wasn't in what he did. It was in what followed him home." Derry never published his research. His papers were boxed and stored in the archives, but one reel of magnetic tape has no label except the date, May 12, 1947, and the words Hartwell Audio. The reel remains unreleased due to degradation of material. Archivists who handled it claim the tape emits a faint ticking sound when unspooled, though it contains no audible recording. During a renovation in 1949, a section of the West Annex's new foundation cracked after a mild tremor. Workers filled the gap with fresh concrete, but one of them, interviewed years later, said the hole seemed deeper than any foundation should have been. "We dropped a plumb line," he recalled. "It never hit bottom." He left Augusta soon after. Another worker, more superstitious, brought a vial of holy water and poured it over the site before they sealed it again. "No reason," he told his supervisor. "Just felt right." The college archives from 1950 list no further incidents, no disappearances, no anomalies. Officially, the building was stabilized, the structure modernized, and the past sealed for good. Yet those who lived nearby swore that during heavy storms, when the drains overflowed and thunder rolled down the river valley, the ground beneath the west side of campus trembled ever so slightly, as though something old was shifting in its sleep. By the mid-1950s, the Medical College of Georgia stood as a symbol of modern science, its new wings bright with electric light and tiled corridors scrubbed clean of the past. Yet, beneath the polished surface, maintenance reports began again to mention the same recurring issue. Persistent dampness in subfloor vents, unexplained source. Technicians inspected the drainage systems repeatedly, but the water that pooled there was not rainwater. It smelled faintly of alcohol and faintly of something else, something organic. A memorandum from 1956 notes that the moisture carried trace elements consistent with preserved tissue fluid, though no laboratory had such materials in that part of the building. The memo was signed by a facilities director named Harlan Pierce, who left the college later that year. In his resignation letter, he wrote a single line, "I have come to believe the walls here breathe." By 1958, new construction finally covered the last exposed section of the old foundations. The workmen complained of a constant draft coming from nowhere. One of them, identified in payroll records as J.B. Flanagan, claimed to have found a sealed cavity under a collapsed archway. He described it to his supervisor as a room that shouldn't exist, dry in the center but wet on the walls, like it's sweating from the inside. When the foreman inspected the area, he found nothing but filled concrete. Yet later that night, Flanagan was seen standing in the rain by the main gates, staring back toward the annex. He left town the next morning, never collecting his final pay. That same spring, a professor of pathology requested permission to display early medical instruments for an upcoming centennial feature. While sorting through storage, he came across a small glass jar sealed with wax, containing a folded page browned with age. The page bore Hartwell's handwriting, recognized later T. Through comparison with archived notes, it was a rough sketch of human anatomy, the sternum and ribs, but drawn with subtle distortions, as though the chest opened downward like a door. At the bottom, Hartwell had written, "Still listening." The professor turned the jar over to administration. and it was catalogued under unverified archival material. Within a month, the jar disappeared. No investigation followed. Sometime later, a janitor sweeping the hall reported hearing faint tapping sounds in the plumbing after midnight. 3 knocks, a pause, and 3 more, repeating. He believed it was trapped air until he shut the main valve and the tapping continued. His supervisor dismissed it as temperature expansion, but the janitor quit that same week, leaving his broom against the basement door. Over time, staff learned not to question such things. The newer generations had no memory of Hartwell or of the Old West Annex. They walked above its buried remains daily, unaware. Yet a few of the elder faculty, those who had inherited the silence, avoided the corridor on rainy nights. The college had grown, but the ground beneath it had never truly dried. By 1961, the Medical College of Georgia had become a modern institution, with laboratories gleaming in fluorescent light. The old West Wing, now hidden behind concrete and progress, had almost vanished from collective memory. Yet memory has a way of seeping through walls. That summer, a small electrical fire broke out in the sub-level storage rooms. Firefighters contained it quickly, but one of them, Captain Morris Lang, filed an unusual observation in his incident report. Heavy smoke originated from behind a sealed masonry section, not from wiring or equipment. Sounded like air movement behind it, rhythmic, slow. When asked if it could have been an exhaust leak, he shook his head. "It was breathing," he said. "I swear to God, it was breathing." The administration dismissed his account, but the following month, maintenance logs note structural sweating reappearing on the same wall. The substance was clear, odorless, slightly sticky. A chemical analysis returned inconclusive results. The technician who performed the test resigned 2 days later. In 1963, a visiting researcher from Atlanta, Dr. Elaine Firth, arrived to study the college's early records for a historical monograph. Her letters home, preserved in her family's estate, describe her fascination with the 1913 period. She wrote, "Every mention of Hartwell is faint, as though erased by careful hands. Yet his presence lingers in margins, in footnotes, like a shadow on paper." She requested permission to view the original West Annex foundation for context. The request was denied without explanation. Undeterred, Firth interviewed several elderly townsfolk who had once worked near the campus. One recalled hearing music from under the ground during the 1930s renovation, soft, irregular, like humming through metal. Another claimed her father once carried bricks from the demolished wall and that they wept clear what. For weeks, Firth documented each account meticulously, intending to publish her findings, but her draft manuscript, titled Anatomy of Silence, was never completed. She vanished from her boarding house in 1964, leaving behind her notes in a suitcase. The only clue found was a library checkout slip bearing the faint impression of a ring, perfectly circular, damp to the touch. Her disappearance was never connected publicly to the college, yet within faculty correspondence that year, one typed line stands out: "Cease discussion of the 1913 incidents. The Hartwell matter remains closed. No author, no recipient, just the line itself, filed among routine meeting minutes." In the decades that followed, Dr. Firth's notes circulated quietly among students of local history. Some dismissed them as fiction. Others swore by their accuracy. A few even visited the site, hoping to glimpse remnants of the West Foundation. One such visitor described hearing knocking underfoot, near the old archway, stones now embedded in the courtyard path. The sound was faint, almost patient. It stopped when he stepped back. When rain began to fall, the stones grew darker, and the air smelled faintly of spirits. By the late 1960s, the city of Augusta had begun to sprawl outward, and with every new building the ground beneath the medical college seemed to sigh under the weight of years. Those who worked night shifts in the newer laboratories spoke of subtle vibrations that ran through the floors after midnight, never violent, only steady, like something deep below was drawing breath. An electrician named Warren Gill was called to inspect a flickering circuit in the sub-basement. He reported a faint, pulsing light from a gap in the wall near a long-forgotten service tunnel. "Could have been a candle," he told his supervisor, "but no flame moves that slow." The next day, the gap was sealed with concrete. The report was stamped "closed." A week later, Jill's wife filed a missing person complaint. His tools were found neatly stacked in the boiler room, all wiped clean. His coat hung on a nail, still damp from rain. There was no further inquiry. The administration announced routine electrical upgrades and barred entry to the lower levels for safety. 1969 brought heavy floods to Georgia, and the drainage beneath the college failed again. A custodian's note mentions water rising from below, not descending from pipes. The city engineers blamed a subterranean spring, though none had ever been mapped in that area. One of the workers, attempting to pump out the water, claimed that when his flashlight struck the surface, he saw ripples spreading outward, as if disturbed by movement beneath. He refused to return the next day. The Augusta Chronicle printed a small article about mysterious basement flooding, but it was buried in the local section beside advertisements for hardware stores. People had grown used to oddities from the old quarter of town. The college continued its work, teaching new generations of surgeons who dissected bodies without knowledge of whose ground they stood upon. Dury says, in that decade, a researcher cataloging old photographs stumbled across a damaged, negative, mislabeled Specimen Storage, 1913. It showed the familiar hall, the iron tables, the brick walls, but in the far corner stood a shape no one could explain. Not a shadow, not a trick of exposure, but something upright, bearded and drenched. The archivist sent it for cleaning. When the negative was returned, the shape was gone, erased without a trace. The technician who performed the restoration swore the damage was chemical. Yet others who saw the original negative insist it had been clear, the figure perfectly defined. In 1970, a renovation plan called for replacing the old courtyard, where the west foundation stones had been repurposed. The project halted unexpectedly after workers discovered that the soil beneath remained saturated. Samples were sent to the university lab. Their composition matched neither groundwater nor runoff, but contained traces of formaldehyde, decades old, as if preserved within the earth itself. The chief engineer filed his report with a single handwritten note beneath the summary. Smells like memory. By 1972, the old campus had begun to change faces. Modern glass windows replaced the weathered arches, and the last of the original stonework was scheduled for removal. The contractor, a pragmatic man named Alan Hoyt, laughed off the stories he heard from older custodians. Until the first night his crew stayed late. They were cutting through foundation stone when the power failed suddenly. In the dim emergency light, Hoyt's men swore they heard a low hum rising from beneath their boots, followed by 3 deliberate knocks, spaced like slow heartbeats. They dropped their tools and left without collecting their pay. Hoyt finished the job alone. 2 days later, he filed a complaint with the county inspector claiming that moisture was condensing from the floor upward. His request for reassessment was denied. Within weeks, he suffered a breakdown, convinced something was breathing through the concrete. His wife later found him sitting motionless by their cellar door at home, muttering, "He's studying again." He never returned to work. In 1974, the college hosted a centennial exhibition celebrating a century of medicine. Among the displayed relics was a small glass plate photograph, the same group image once thought destroyed, that had mysteriously resurfaced. This time the blurred figure near the west wall was more distinct, as if the damage had reversed itself. Visitors whispered about it, but curators dismissed the anomaly as reflection. On the final day of the exhibit, the plate shattered inside its case without anyone touching it. A chemical odor filled the gallery. Maintenance staff wearing gloves collected the fragments and sealed them away, but by morning the shards were gone. Only the label remained. Dissection Hall, 1913. A week later, a professor working in pathology recorded a note for his lecture. Always remember the principle of preservation. The body was persists being forgotten. The next morning, his students found the same words carved faintly into the metal of a dissection tray. No one ever determined who did it. The tray was removed and replaced, but the carved one was never seen again. That winter, a small fire erupted in one of the storage rooms below the West Annex. The sprinkler system failed, and though no one was hurt, Investigators found the flames had burned in a perfect circle on the concrete floor, leaving the surrounding paper untouched. Electrical arc, the report claimed, though no wires ran through that section. When asked about the smell, one fireman said, "It wasn't smoke. It was something like alcohol." By then, few on campus knew the story of Elias Hartwell. His name had become a ghost of a rumor, passed between students on stormy nights. Yet, in the stillness of certain hallways, when the lights dimmed, there remained a sense that study was still in session, that the work he began in 1913 had not yet concluded. By the time 1976 arrived, the story of the West Annex had faded into whispers, but its residue lingered in quiet ways, through damp walls, unexplained odors, and a sense of watchfulness that came over anyone alone in the sublevels after midnight. The administration ordered a complete sealing of the old tunnels beneath the campus, calling it a modernization project. Workers filled the corridors with concrete, but one man on the crew, Clifford Dent, later confided to a colleague that he had heard something while pouring the last mix. "It wasn't echo," he said. "It was a voice, soft like it came through water, said my name." Dent never returned to the site. He moved to North Carolina that same month and refused to speak of Augusta again. The report of his sudden departure made no mention of the project, only personal reasons. That autumn, a graduate student named Harold Pruitt began collecting folklore accounts for his anthropology thesis on institutional myths in Southern academia. The Medical College of Georgia appeared in several interviews, mostly as a footnote about the man in the flooded morgue. Pruitt tracked the origins to an anonymous letter preserved in the Augusta Historical Society, dated 1919, unsigned, describing a student whose study outlasted his body. He became obsessed, requesting access to sealed campus archives. The college allowed him limited access, but the file folder labeled West Annex 1913 to 1914 contained nothing but a blank sheet of paper and an envelope ringed with a faint watermark shaped like a circle. When he held it to the light, he swore he saw faint lines of handwriting that vanished as soon as he blinked. In his thesis notes recovered after his death, he wrote, "The absence is deliberate. Someone erased a man without removing his reflection." Pruitt drowned in 1977 during a research trip along the Savannah River. His recorder was found intact, though the final minute of the tape contained only slow, uneven knocking. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. Experts called it interference from the boat hull. The tape now sits in storage, marked unexplained mechanical noise. That same year, renovations in the sub-basement unearthed a rusted cabinet that had been bricked over. Inside were several glass jars filled with cloudy liquid. One jar had shattered, releasing a faint odor of alcohol and decay. The surviving jars were catalogued and shipped to a university lab for analysis, but all records of their arrival end abruptly after transit. The driver's manifest stops mid-sentence. No follow-up shipment was ever confirmed. When questioned decades later, a surviving lab technician remembered only that one jar had something folded inside. In 1979, a new dean requested a comprehensive inspection of the West foundations before constructing an auditorium above them. Engineers reported the soil as stable but perpetually moist. One geologist suggested draining it, but the project was abandoned after the pumps repeatedly failed, clogged by a residue thick as gelatin. A student who helped with the cleanup said the residue shimmered like oil and left a smell that clung to skin for days. Officially, it was recorded as organic buildup. Unofficially, the workers began to refer to it by a single name, Hartwell's sweat. By 1981, the name Hartwell had vanished from official lips, yet the college carried his presence in the quiet habits of its halls. Custodians kept lights on in unused rooms, professors avoided the lowest stairwell, and students dared one another to press their ears against the basement walls after rainstorms. Some claimed to hear tapping, others nothing at all, but everyone admitted to feeling something, not sound exactly, but pressure, a pulse behind the bricks. A visiting historian from Emory University, Dr. Clara Mendel, arrived that spring to write about Augusta's early medical folklore. She requested interviews with senior faculty, but most refused. One elderly professor, who had taught anatomy for 40 years, agreed to speak under condition of anonymity. Mendel's notes quote him as saying, "The trouble wasn't madness, it was memory. The walls remember better than we do." She thought it poetic until he insisted that the walls literally changed color after storms. She laughed it off then, but later described seeing moisture spread upward from the floor in thin lines like veins drawing breath. When Mendel attempted to corroborate her findings, she discovered that the college archive's microfilm reels from 1913 to 1915 had deteriorated completely. The archivist swore they'd been stable months earlier. A chemical odor lingered in the cabinet, sharp and metallic. Within weeks, Mendel fell ill with pneumonia and left Augusta, abandoning her research. Her unfinished manuscript, titled The Wet Man of Green Street, was later found among her papers, the final page blank, except for one line in her handwriting. "It's not the dead who haunt us, it's what they remember." Around that same time, the college began constructing a new auditorium directly over the buried West Foundation. During excavation, the crew unearthed an old brass plaque corroded to near illegibility. Only one word remained readable: student. The foreman turned it over to the site office, but by morning it had disappeared. That night, a security guard reported hearing footsteps on wet stone beneath the empty lot. His log ends mid-sentence. 2 days later, the foreman sealed the hole with concrete, muttering, "If he wants quiet, let him have it." In 1983, a young medical resident reported an incident while studying late in one of the labs above the old foundation. He described feeling sudden cold around his ankles, as though standing in shallow water. When he looked down, the floor was dry. Moments later, the lights flickered and his reflection in the glass door appeared to move a half-second behind him. He ran, leaving his notes scattered. When he returned the next morning, the glass bore faint condensation shaped like handprints, one small, one large, both facing inward. Maintenance chalked it up to humidity, yet the prints remained visible for 3 days, darkening when touched by light. After that, the lab was repainted and reassigned for storage. By the decade's end, the West Annex had been erased from every blueprint, yet its coordinates still lingered in the city records, marked as restricted ground. And in Augusta, during thunderstorms, old-timers still claimed you could hear the slow echo of dissection tables being dragged across wet stone, each scrape followed by a pause, like a teacher waiting for his student to answer. By 1986, the modernization of the Medical College of Georgia was complete. The walls gleamed white, the old staircases gone, and with them most visible traces of the 19th century. Yet, the land itself seemed reluctant to forget. The basement humidity persisted no matter how the ventilation was improved. During one maintenance check that year, a team recorded humidity at 89% directly above the buried West Foundation, even though the rest of the building read normal. The technician joked that something down there's still sweating. His supervisor didn't laugh. That same month, a freshman medical student fainted during a dissection. When revived, she told her instructor that she had seen someone standing behind the reflection of the glass door, wearing old clothes, beard dripping, looking at the cadaver like it was still breathing. She was sent to the infirmary for exhaustion and later withdrew from the program. The incident was never documented publicly, but her roommate later told classmates that the girl woke at night hearing the sound of a jar lid turning slowly beside her bed. In 1988, the college hosted a lecture series on the ethics of anatomical study. The visiting speaker, Dr. Malcolm Kearns, began his talk by referencing a notorious incident at the Medical College of Georgia in the early 1900s, citing it as an example of lost humanity in early medical education. The room fell silent. Several senior staff left before he finished. His notes, later published in a small academic journal, include a marginal comment. Hartwell was not myth, found evidence of ledger entry matching witness accounts. The journal retracted the article the following year, citing verification concerns. But a photocopy circulated privately among students, fueling old whispers. Around this time, a custodial worker discovered a small patch of condensation on a WA. Well, that had no plumbing behind it. As he wiped it away, he noticed faint letters forming beneath the surface. H-A-R, before the moisture spread and erased them. He never mentioned it officially, but told his nephew later that the wall wanted to speak. The nephew, a photography student, sneaked into the basement with a camera one evening in 1989. He captured only one image before his flash malfunctioned. The photo, when developed, showed a faint human silhouette in the fogged air, head bowed over what appeared to be a table. The student dismissed it as lens reflection until he noticed a second figure faintly visible in the background, watching. That same year, a structural inspection recorded a subtle vibration in the western subfloor, rhythmic and measured, continuing even when all machinery was shut down. The engineer labeled it unidentified mechanical resonance. When he returned the next day to measure again, the vibration had stopped. Beneath his signature, someone later penciled a small ring, almost perfect, like the outline of a jar pressed into damp paper. By the end of the decade, the college expanded into new medical buildings, farther from the original site. The West Annex remained sealed, buried under decades of construction, but on particularly humid nights, those who passed through the old hallway sometimes caught the faintest sound, metal scraping lightly, as if someone below was preparing instruments for a lesson long delayed. By 1991, the Medical College of Georgia stood as a model of progress, its modern facade giving no hint of the secrets sealed beneath. Yet storms that year brought record flooding, and the drainage systems failed once again. Water rose from the ground instead of falling from above, seeping through cracks in the pavement outside the west wing. The security cameras captured nothing unusual, only hours of empty corridors. But the guard on duty, an older man named Harold Boone, later swore in an unsigned report that he'd seen a man walking just beyond the reflection of the glass doors, moving in rhythm with his own steps, but on the other side of the light. He wrote, "His coat was soaked, beard dripping, eyes fixed on the floor, looked like an old photograph come alive." Boone quit the next day, leaving his uniform on the desk. During cleanup, maintenance crews found silt and fragments of bone embedded in the drains. The official explanation listed them as animal remains brought in by floodwater. But a lab assistant who handled the samples claimed one fragment had sutures consistent with human cranial structure. When she tried to log it for verification, the entry system froze. The digital file corrupted itself, filling the screen with blank fields and a single repeating word: retained. The machine was replaced the next week. In early 1993, an alumnus from the 1960s, now a historian, requested access to the original blueprints for a book about the evolution of the campus. He noted an anomaly. The dimensions of the West Foundation didn't match any standing structure. There was a space, roughly 12 feet long, 8 wide, recorded in 1913 as cadaver storage, but never reassigned. When he inquired further, the facilities office replied curtly, "Room removed during reconstruction." Yet when he compared aerial surveys, the ground above it showed a subtle depression, visible only after rain. His notes mention a quote from a groundskeeper: "That patch never dries no matter how hot it gets." Later that year, a small exhibition was arranged to celebrate the college's sesquicentennial. A section of it honored pioneers of Southern medical science. Among the artifacts was a restored photograph from 1913, previously catalogued as unidentified. It showed a single student seated beside an anatomy table, his expression tense, almost fearful, the light catching droplets on his chin that looked like water. The label read simply, "Unknown student, circa 1913. Visitors reportedly felt uneasy around the image. One man described hearing faint scratching when he stood near it. Another claimed the reflection of the glass case showed not one figure, but two. After 3 days on display, the photo's glass shattered overnight. Security footage showed no movement, yet at the exact moment of the break, the hallway lights dimmed, and a soft knocking echoed through the walls. 3 slow taps, followed by a pause. Administrators replaced the frame, removed the photo, and never mentioned it again. But custodians whispered that the glass case still fogged on humid nights, leaving behind a perfect circular print that no cleaning could remove. They began to call it the ring, a quiet nod to the mark first noted in Leland's old letter. proof that some lessons in Augusta never end, only change rooms. By 1996, few at the Medical College of Georgia spoke the name Hartwell aloud. The story had thinned into rumor, whispered only among night custodians and sleepless interns. Yet during a summer renovation of the western courtyard, a crew discovered an uneven patch of ground where concrete had cracked in a perfect circle. Beneath it lay a cavity no larger than a coffin. When the first slab was lifted, a burst of warm, damp air escaped, carrying with it the faint scent of ethanol and rust. Inside was nothing visible. No bones, no instruments, only dark, viscous water that shimmered faintly when light touched it. The foreman, unnerved, ordered it resealed immediately. The next morning, he was gone, his truck abandoned by the river. His clipboard was found in the mud, the final note written in pencil. He's awake again. No record of the incident appears in college files, but a maintenance log from that week lists unexplained subsidence near West Courtyard. Resolved. That same year, a photography student working on a project titled Structures of Memory captured a long exposure image of the west facade. When developed, the photo showed streaks of light forming what appeared to be the outline of a man leaning against the wall, one hand braced as if listening. The student dismissed it as exposure error until another photographer reproduced the shot under different conditions, with the same result. Both prints were later stolen from the campus darkroom. In 1998, a new storage wing was added to the college, extending further over the original foundations. Construction halted several times due to flooding, though no rain had fallen. Workers joked that the ground bleeds formalin. One laborer reported hearing a metallic dragging sound beneath the earth, rhythmic and slow, like someone pulling a table. His co-workers laughed it off, but 2 weeks later he refused to return to the site, claiming he'd heard the same sound beneath his apartment floor. The foreman replaced him and filed no report. By the end of that year, the newly built storage rooms were complete, climate-controlled, and sealed with stainless steel doors. But the humidity sensors in one corner registered impossible fluctuations, cycling from 0 to 90% in minutes. The engineers replaced the system twice before giving up, marking the anomaly as sensor fault. Decades later, the error still appears during storms. Around this time, a graduate thesis on the medical folklore of the American South briefly referenced the Hartwell story, citing Dr. Elaine Firth's vanished manuscript and the persistent rumors of the West Annex. The student's advisor advised removing the section, calling it irrelevant myth. The final paper omitted all mention, but the discarded draft, found years later in a box of unused notes, contained a line underlined twice. He was never buried. He was absorbed. In Augusta, those who still lived near the old campus began noticing water seeping from cracks in the sidewalks after long dry spells. City crews blamed broken irrigation lines. Yet one plumber who inspected the area told a friend, "That ain't water. It smells like time." By 2001, the city of Augusta had changed beyond recognition. The Medical College of Georgia now stood surrounded by glass towers and paved courtyards where the old brick halls once leaned into their shadows. Yet during demolition for a new research wing, an excavation crew uncovered a stretch of older masonry, thick, uneven, still damp. The project lead ordered it photographed before removal. The first image came out perfectly normal. In the second, a faint distortion appeared, as if the lens had caught something behind the wall. A dim human outline, eyes level with the camera. The technician deleted the file, but when he opened his storage drive later that evening, the same image had reappeared under a different name. Elias, 1913, JPG. He left his position the next morning. The new structure rose quickly, swallowing the last of the West Annex. Yet no matter how the engineers reinforced the foundation, the same problem recurred, persistent condensation spreading in a circle. When they drilled to test for pressure, the bit struck hollow space only 12 feet down. The foreman logged it as void cavity. It was filled with polymer foam and forgotten. A year later, during a campus electrical test, an emergency alarm triggered throughout the lower levels. 3 short beeps, then a pause, repeating in sequence. The pattern puzzled technicians. It didn't match any system code. The alarm ceased after 5 minutes, though several witnesses claimed to hear a knocking sound continuing for nearly an hour afterward, faint but steady, somewhere deep in the foundation. No follow-up investigation was recorded. In 2003, a documentary team filming a history piece on Southern medical institutions interviewed residents who still remembered the old stories. One retired custodian said quietly to the camera, "The rain goes down but comes up through him. Every spring he tests the locks." When asked who, he only replied, "The one who never finished learning." The footage was never aired, but a still frame shows the man glancing toward the west wall, his reflection perfectly clear, though no glass was behind him. The producers later called it lens error. By 2007, the college had changed names, changed deans, and outlasted most memories of Hartwell. The last official record that might connect to him appears in a maintenance ticket for water damage beneath the auditorium. Persistent damp patch, smells of spirits. It was marked completed, though no repairs were logged. Since then, students have spoken of sudden cold along the west corridor and the sound of soft dripping even on dry days. Some say, if you listen closely, you can still hear pages turning, slow and patient, as though someone continues his study where he left off. Others refuse to speak of it at all. The Medical College of Georgia remains one of the South's oldest and most respected institutions of learning. Its halls stand bright, its foundations strong, or so the reports say. But those who walk through on stormy nights claim that beneath the hum of modern machinery, another rhythm persists, measured, deliberate, like breath drawn from deep underground. And when the rain begins to rise from the ground instead of falling, the air turns faintly sweet, almost like formalin, and the floors seem to shift ever so slightly, as if the college itself remembers. Some stories end in discovery. Others, like this one, remain sealed within their walls, unfinished, unburied, and quietly alive beneath the soil of Georgia.